They didn't realize the woman they just slapped wasn't just a judge. She was the one who would make the entire system tremble. A slap during a courtroom session may have seemed personal, but in truth, it was a declaration of war against an unjust system that had endured for decades. In Detroit, where justice had long been a distant luxury for people of color, a 61-year-old black female judge was struck in her own courtroom. But she didn't strike back with her fists. She stood up and made the entire city listen. This isn't just the story of a woman being disrespected. It's the story of thousands who were once silenced, once forgotten, and now they have someone who dares to speak on their behalf. Detroit, Michigan, the steel city that cracked. Once the industrial heartbeat of America, now cloaked in the dust of time, of injustice, and of promises never kept. Its streets still echo with history, not the kind printed in textbooks, but the kind etched into the skin of black communities, day by day, generation after generation. Among the skeletons of old bank buildings now reduced to crumbling brick walls, one courthouse still stood. Not because it was beloved, but because it was the last place that still resembled order. And at its center stood Naomi Cartera, 63-year-old black woman, the longest-serving judge still presiding in Wayne County's judicial district. Naomi was neither tall, nor loud, nor fond of the spotlight. But when she walked into a room, silence followed. Her presence was a gravity quiet, measured, inescapable, like the hush before a verdict. Her salt and pepper hair neatly pinned, her eyes sharp but tired. Naomi Carter was living proof that for a black woman to stay in power, she couldn't just be good. She had to be unshakable. She had presided over more than 1,000 cases, criminal, civil, and administrative. She once made a state senator apologize for a racial slur in open court. But never once had she raised her voice. Never once had she allowed emotion to override the law. She was the Lawat, least within those 4 courtroom walls. Which is why that morning, no one thought the day would be different. Detroit was still damp from an overnight rain. Courtroom 4 opened like any other day with a minor case about public property damage involving a 17-year-old black boy. A young prosecutor sat at one table. Opposite him, a newly appointed public defender, still fumbling through papers. Naomi hadn't yet put on her robe. She always arrived 15 minutes early to review files at the clerk's desk, a ritual shaped by decades. But robe or not, she was still the authority in the room. That's when 2 officers walked in. Officer Travis Raleigh White, tall, swaggering like he owned the place. At his side, Officer Darrell Knox Younger, also white, with a half smirk curling the corner of his mouth as he spotted Naomi leaning over the case file. No greeting. No nod of respect. Raleigh slammed his palm on the desk. "We're waiting on the judge. Go get her." Naomi lifted her gaze and looked him straight in the eye. "I'm the one you're waiting for." The first eyebrow twitch. A flicker of confusion. Then Raleigh snorted. "Right. You're what, clerk?" Naomi said nothing. She stepped forward, picked up her file. The silence that followed wasn't respected, was the air holding its breath before a storm. And then, without warning, without hesitation, Raleigh stepped forward and slapped Naomi Carter across the face. It wasn't a strike of rage. It was a strike of entitlement. A slap meant for a waitress, not a judge. An action so instinctive, it proved he never thought he had to think. The sound smack wasn't even loud, but it sucked every drop of oxygen out of the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Naomi didn't either. She stood still, her left cheek turning red, her eyes piercing through Raleigh like lasers cutting through a mask. No fury. No shouting. No reaction. Just a look. And that look chilled the room several degrees. The public defender's mouth hung open. The prosecutor stood, but didn't step forward. Even the court officers hesitated, eyes darting toward the security camera. Naomi Carter slowly turned her back. And in that suffocating silence, she picked up her judicial robe. No one helped her. No one dared speak. She did it alone, just as she always had. It took only seconds. But when she ascended the bench and looked down from above, the courtroom was no longer the same. A system had just struck its own moral core. And now, it would have to pay. There are moments that can't be undone, rewritten, or excused. And that slap was one of them. Before it landed, no one believed a police officer would dare raise a hand inside a courtroom. Not in front of colleagues, attorneys, clerks, even law students taking notes from the corner. But that moment, that slap shattered every boundary. Not just between people, but between the system and the truth. Officer Travis Raleigh didn't back down after what he'd done. On the contrary, he stood tall, exhaling with arrogant satisfaction, like he had just taught the mouthy woman a much-needed lesson. His partner, Officer Knox, did nothing. But the look in his eyes wasn't one of shock or shame. It was something else, something disturbingly close to thrill. Naomi Carter remained still. She didn't reach for her cheek. She didn't say a word. But her gazon that carried 30 years of service, 30 years of restraint, 30 years of enduring the judgment of all white panels, that gaze silenced the room in a way no gavel could. A court clerk took a step back. A law student dropped their pen. The young prosecutor, barely 2 years out of law school, turned pale as paper. Raleigh withdrew his hand, but not with remorse. He scanned the room, then scoffed. "What, you people gonna file a report over that too?" Naomi still didn't speak. But one breath later, she turned, reached for her robe hanging by the bench. A movement she had done thousands of times. But this time, it wasn't routine. It was a declaration. She slowly pulled the black robe over her shoulders. Each button fastened deliberately, one by one. No one moved. No one dared speak. The air was thick, like a crime scene that everyone in the room had just witnessed. When she stepped up to the bench, her stride steady, it wasn't her steps that froze the room. It was her gaze from above. A view of authority that every person there should have recognized. Before it was too late. Then her voice rang out, clear, controlled, precise. Like a blade slicing through the false fabric of order. "Officer Raleigh, may I confirm you just used physical force against a court officer inside this courtroom?" Raleigh raised an eyebrow, playing confused. "Court officer? You kidding me? You weren't wearing a robe. I thought you were." "Thought I was what, officer?" Naomi in, her voice dropping. "A clerk? A cleaning lady? An old black woman just picking up papers?" Raleigh stumbled, then smirked. "I didn't know who you were. No name tag, no robe. I was just asking some random woman to step away from the files." His excuse dropped into the room like a stone in a deep well. No one picked it up. No one believed it. Naomi looked him in the eye. "So tell me, officer, do you normally slap people you don't know?" Silence. Officer Knox began inching toward the door, hand twitching near his belt. The young prosecutor started typing furious, likely messaging someone above. And in the corner, Hank, a black court security guard who had stood at that door for 2 decades, rested his hand gently on his belt, for the first time in his career. Raleigh's confidence started to wither. His voice cracked. I didn't know you were. Judge Naomi Carter, Wayne County Superior Court. The woman you just slapped in front of a live security camera. Naomi's tone sharpened. No longer cool. Now forged steel. You have committed felony assault on a sitting state judge during the execution of her duties. And there is no statute in this nation that permits you to hide behind ignorance to justify violence. The silence cracked. A soft shuffle. Someone had started live streaming. And then, a sea of phones went up. That slap-on act that might have been swept under the rug like so many unwitnessed incidents was no longer deniable. It was documented, not just by surveillance footage, but by dozens of eyes in the room. And now, by thousands more watching online. Naomi turned to the prosecutor. File an immediate incident report. Then, she looked back at Raleigh. No hatred, no rage. Just the gaze of a judge who had just watched a defendant confess in real time. Your slap didn't hurt me. It confirmed what I've known for a long time. This system doesn't have to break to reveal its rot." She said nothing more. But everyone in that courtroom knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The courtroom had never been this silent. No coughing, no shifting, just a tension thick as blades hanging in the air. A silence not born from reverence, but from fear. Fear that what everyone had just witnessed was real. And then, as if the room's every breath waited for confirmation, Naomi Carter stepped up to the bench. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She didn't lash out, as some might have expected after such a humiliating slap. Instead, she reached for her black robe. Her movements were slow, deliberate, ceremonial. As the robe draped over her body, it seemed to shimmer with decades of quiet resilience. Each stitch sewn with discipline, each fold pressed by battles fought in silence. When she lifted her head, everything changed. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, then locked on the man who had dared to strike her. Sergeant Mark Ryland. Gone was his smug confidence. All that remained was confusion and a flicker of regret too late to matter. Naomi took her seat on the bench. Her fingers tapped the old wood 3 times, each knock a bell toll echoing in the souls of those who believed power could go unpunished. "Sergeant Ryland," she said, her voice calm but blade sharp, "I want you to state, under oath, what you just did and why." Ryland stammered. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just someone interfering." Naomi pressed her lips together, a faint smile. Not of forgiveness, but of revelation. "Let me ask you then, if I were a white man, in plain clothes, standing in this courtroom, would you have slapped me?" No one answered. All eyes turned to Ryland. "No," Naomi said, answering for him, her eyes never leaving his. "Because you would have paused. You would have calculated. You would have wondered who he might be. You would have hesitated, like you always do with people you think have power." Ryland's face crumpled. "But with me, black woman without a robe, you didn't pause. You judged." The room tensed. In the back, a young journalist quietly pressed record. An old lawyer nodded slowly, hearing words he'd never had the courage to say himself. "You didn't just slap me, Sergeant," Naomi continued. "You slapped the very concept of justice. You struck at the belief that even those without uniforms or titles still deserve dignity." Ryland's breath grew shallow. Sweat glistened on his forehead. "You think ignorance is a defense?" Naomi said, her voice steady, but cold enough to freeze a spine. "Then I'll give you a chance to explain. To the press, to the cameras, and to the millions waiting to see justice not just spoken, but enforced." She turned to the court clerk. "Please enter into the official record. Sergeant Mark Ryland's conduct will be submitted to the Detroit Police Conduct Oversight Board. I will be requesting a full investigation into every case he has been involved in." Then she turned back to the courtroom. "Today, you witnessed misconduct. Not in a shadowed hallway. Not behind closed doors. But here, in the very room meant to represent the law." She paused, letting each word settle into the bones of those present. "And if any of your reporters, lawyers, court staff, have ever stayed silent about slaps like this one, today is the day your silence must end." In that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a place of trial. It had become the scene of an awakening. Naomi rose. "This session is adjourned, but the trial of the system has only just begun." And she stepped down from the bench, not weighed down by shame, but lifted by pride, because for the first time in years of serving justice in silence, Naomi Carter had spoken out. And for the first time, justice listened. When the courtroom door shut behind Naomi Carter, the heavy groan of its hinges rang out like a declaration. The storm has begun. Naomi walked slowly but firmly down the corridor leading to her chambers. Every footstep echoed against the old courthouse walls that had witnessed countless hearings and just as many silences. But today was different. No one looked at her as just another judge. No longer the stern black woman in robes. They looked at her as an earthquake moving beneath the foundations of Detroit's justice system. And they had reason to be afraid. The moment she sat down in her office chair, Naomi motioned to her assistant Alondra, a young, brown-skinned clerk, to close the door and allow no interruptions. Her hand gently touched her left cheek, where the echo of Ryland's slap still lingered. Not because it hurt, but because it needed to be remembered. She turned to her computer. The cold blue light of the login screen flickered to life. Naomi didn't call the press. She didn't make a statement. She didn't go online. Instead, she opened the court's internal database, a secure system accessible only to the presiding judge, and typed one name, Mark Ryland. Within seconds, the data filled the screen. 18 years on the force. 9 official complaints. 4 internal investigations closed with insufficient evidence. 0 disciplinary actions. A spotless record. But it reeked of a system rotting from the inside out. Naomi exhaled slowly. Each line on that screen was another fracture in the faith she had spent nearly 3 decades trying to preserve. "Alondra," she called out, voice steady but weighted. "I need a full report from Internal Affairs on every complaint filed against Sergeant Ryland in the past 10 years. Also, give me the list of all his arrests, especially those involving excessive force or disputed charges." Alondra froze for a moment. "All of them?" she asked, half shocked, half scared. "All of them, and call the Independent Investigation Unit. I want all security footage from Courtroom 3 this morning backed up and sent directly to the Michigan Department of Judicial Oversight. No edits. No delays." She paused, then looked directly at her assistant. "And send me a copy." Naomi's quiet fury had turned into decisive action. No more doubt. No more waiting for apologies. The investigation had begun, not to reclaim personal dignity, but to rip the rug off a system that had buried too much filth for far too long. That afternoon, an emergency meeting was called inside the office of the Chief Judge of Wayne County. Present, Naomi Carter, a rep from Internal Affairs, a state auditor from the Judicial Oversight Division, and the court's compliance attorney. Naomi didn't waste time. "I have a video pulled from courtroom security at 8:41 a.m. this morning," she began. "In it, Sergeant Mark Ryland assaults a sitting judge me without confirming identity. I don't need discussion. I need action." The room fell silent. The state auditor spoke first. "We've received a duplicate of the footage. Preservation protocols are underway. We'll be coordinating with Internal Affairs to re-examine all previously dismissed complaints. There's reason to believe those records were tampered with," Naomi said, her tone lower, more deliberate. "And I don't believe Ryland acted alone." The compliance attorney raised an eyebrow. "You mean?" "I believe there are links inside the prosecutor's office, possibly within the court itself, that have shielded behavior like this," Naomi said plainly. "This is no longer about assumptions. It's about truth." Her eyes lit not with anger, but with something rarer in her world. Hope. The kind that comes from finally refusing to stay quiet. That night, Naomi sat alone in her office. Detroit glowed faintly outside her window. A skyline of secrets still hiding in the dark. She opened her laptop. One by one, she began reviewing old complaint files. Names she remembered began to appear. Young black men arrested for resisting arrest with no witnesses. Women who claimed abuse then disappeared from the system, unheard and unbelieved. Each file was a story. Each story was evidence. And stitched together, they would become an indictment no one could ignore. Naomi knew this slap wasn't personal. It was the tipping point. The final insult in a long line of quiet contempt. She also knew she couldn't heal everything. But she could expose it. She could illuminate it. She could begin. Because today, justice didn't just wear a robe. It had a name. And that name was Naomi Carter. With every new document decrypted, Naomi Carter felt like she was walking backward through a pitch-black tunnel, a place where the light of justice had been suffocated by layers of power dusted on, year after year, generation after generation. She sat quietly in the small office behind her courtroom, surrounded by faded case files, laptop screens stacked with overlapping internal reports, and a whiteboard covered in webs of names and lines, a map of a shadow system slowly taking shape. Every thread led to the same center, and every thread began with a slap that once seemed personal, but had now cracked open the first fault line in a wall of silence the system had built to protect itself. As Internal Affairs started reviewing the cases tied to Officer Derek Ralston, man who slapped her, they found at least 17 arrests with signs of procedural misconduct, missing evidence, witnesses recanting for personal reasons, and a disturbing pattern. Every person arrested was poor, black, or unrepresented. Naomi stared at one familiar name. Tyrese Holloway, 22, arrested for suspicious drug activity. No substances, no witnesses, only Ralston's word. Tyrese had spent 3 years behind bars. Naomi felt her chest tighten. But that was just the surface. An email from Internal Affairs arrived just as Carter, her longtime aide and security confidant, walked in, handing her a thick printed file. A decade's worth of cases handled by ADA Lionel Grayson, all connected to Ralston. Naomi opened the first page and froze. There it was, Judge Henry Mathers. She let the file rest on her desk and leaned back, as if the room had been drained of air. Mathers, the man who brought her into the profession, who once called her the girl too fearless for shadows, who had backed her when she was denied appointment 3 times for being too inexperienced. The man she had trusted absolutely. Naomi Carter was not easily shaken. But this time, she trembled. "Carter," she said hoarsely, "do you still have the handwritten letter he sent me my first year on the bench?" Carter nodded. "It's framed on that wall." Naomi looked over. On the wall near her door hung the letter in glass and wood. Henry Mathers, mentor, friend, witness to a dream carried by the next generation. She had cried the day she received it. Now, she felt nothing. Only a hollow, bitter ache. I need proof. Not just names, actions. Internal Affairs didn't keep her waiting. Agent Latrice Devine, leading the investigation into ADA Grayson, sent her a report, a series of internal emails between the DA's office and the city police department. Dozens of them, sent from an internal account marked only with initials, HM. Requests to go soft or ease pressure in high-profile misconduct cases. Some emails were time-stamped hours after public protests erupted over Ralston's use of force, and a few had been sent from the old server inside City Hall, where Henry Mathers served as honorary legal advisor post-retirement. There was no doubt now. Mathers didn't just know. He helped protect Ralston, and others like him, in the name of stability. Naomi said nothing. She simply stood, removed the glass frame from the wall. Not in anger, but in a cold, mournful finality. "Carter," she said quietly, "log the following. I want every case Henry Mathers ever ruled on involving Derek Ralston or Lionel Grayson pulled spanning 15 years. Carter nodded, expression unreadable. "Including the ones he advised post-retirement?" "Especially those," she replied. "No one stays in the dark anymore." That night, Naomi stayed late in her office. Across her screen, names began to glow. Tyrese, and others who were never given a chance to speak. Some of them were no longer alive to be vindicated. This system wasn't built on one Ralston. It needed protectors, enablers, approvers, and they all had names. They all had titles. They all had signatures. She remembered Mathers' eyes on her the day she walked into her first courtroom as an assistant DA. Eyes she once thought were full of belief. Or were they? Eyes of a man already planning how close she'd be allowed to get. Naomi closed her eyes. Part of her had broken, but the rest, the part that knew what had to be done, had never stood taller. Tomorrow, she would release the first list. No more pleasantries. No more delays. A web of power had just lost its veil, and she would be the one to tear it wide open. You know you've touched something deeper than the surface, when the truth doesn't just silence people, it starts to scare them. Naomi Carter was no stranger to pressure. She had faced appointment boards, skeptical stares at hearings, and decades of being deemed unqualified simply for being a black woman in the justice system. But this was different. It wasn't just pressure. It was a suffocating tension that seeped into the corners of her office, into the air, into her thoughts, a silent cold that had no sound, but crept in like smoke before a fire. Just days after publicly calling out Officer Wilkes in open court, Naomi began noticing signs. Messages from unknown numbers. Bravery doesn't always come with longevity. Best to stop before things spiral out of control. At first, she brushed them off as cheap threats. But then, brown envelope placed in her home mailbox. No postage, no sender. Inside, a distant photo of her granddaughter, Zara, riding her bike home alone after school. Naomi's face went cold. The photo didn't need words. Her heart clenched. This wasn't a warning, it was a declaration. We're watching you. She didn't tell Zara, didn't tell her sister, didn't tell anyone. But deep down, she knew she had just entered a war that was no longer just about justice. It was now about family. They escalated. Another text. Nice house. Sleep tight, Judge Carter. Someone spray painted one word across her car window. Traitor. And then the breaking point. A call in the dead of night. A man's voice, low, calm, emotionless, like reporting the weather. If you don't resign, your loved ones may suffer the consequences. Accidents happen every day in Detroit. Naomi hung up. Saturday alone in the dark. No tears, no shaking, just a silence, the kind that comes right before the storm. She didn't run. She called Carter, the only officer she still trusted. She ordered covert protection for Zara. She hired a private attorney to prep formal charges if it came to that. And most critically, she requested a federal independent investigation, because Naomi understood the people behind these threats weren't just rogue cops. This was a network unraveling, and she was the one who had thrown the first stone through their mirrored glass. She wasn't being targeted by a few thugs in uniform. She was up against the system itself, the same people who once smiled across boardroom tables, shook hands at fundraisers, nodded politely at City Hall. Now, those same faces moved in the shadows, desperate to drag her down quietly. But what terrified them the most wasn't Naomi's strength, it was her quiet resolve. The way she didn't scream, didn't flinch, didn't play the victim. She just kept walking one deliberate step at a time. And with each step, she carved deeper into the facade they thought would never crack. The media took notice. A local journalist uncovered records of complaints that had mysteriously vanished from public files. The story caught fire. The slap became just the headline. Now, reporters were digging into buried lawsuits, sealed settlements, and curious decisions from the ADA's office, the police department, and even the district court. The community rose. Crowds gathered at courthouses, holding signs, "Justice for Naomi. Our courts, our voices. Young people, elders, former defendants wronged by the same system." They didn't just see Naomi as a judge. They saw her as a symbol of voice for a community that had stayed silent far too long. But Naomi didn't celebrate. She knew if she stopped now, they would rewrite the story, say she'd caved, say she cracked. But Naomi Carter, the judge from Detroit, who had spent a lifetime standing tall in storms, never backs down. She was preparing for the next move. Not a punch, not revenge. A counterstrike powered by the law. 1 week after the slap and the courtroom incident, the name Naomi Carter had become more than a symbol of lawful resistance. It had become a testament to the resilience, strength, and fierce wisdom of a seasoned black woman. Local outlets reported daily. and national networks began asking larger questions. What's really going on inside Detroit's justice system? From the Michigan Supreme Court to every corner of predominantly black neighborhoods, Judge Carter's story wasn't just news, it was a wake-up call. And Naomi understood that. She knew that if she handled this quietly, internally, like so many past abuses of power, it would all be diluted. She knew they would try to de-escalate, to remove her from presiding over the case involving Officer Eric Dunley under the guise of conflict of interest. So she moved first. Naomi personally filed a request to withdraw from Dunley's casinat because of pressure, not out of fear, but to ensure that everything would unfold transparently and publicly, leaving no room to question her integrity. On the day of the first public hearing, the courthouse was no longer a place to keep quiet. It had become a platform where truth would speak. Detroit Free Press, CNN, NBC, and more than 24 media outlets were present early. They didn't know exactly what Naomi Carter would reveal. But judging by what had happened so far, they knew an earthquake was coming. She didn't stand alone. By her side was Carter Dixon, her courtroom security officer for the past 15 years. On the other was Rosalind Harris, a representative from Michigan's Internal Investigations Bureau. Each held a thick file in hand. Naomi stepped to the podium, wearing no robe. She stood there as a citizeness, a mother, a woman, a fighter for justice. Her voice was clear, steady, not angry, but it rang like a brass bell through the heart of the city. "I'm not here today to defend myself," she said. "I'm here to defend justice, the justice that's being suffocated by silence, fear, and collusion." She explained that her decision to recuse herself from Officer Dunley's case wasn't due to a lack of confidence, but to ensure that the entire community could witness a process untainted by interference or bias. Then she nodded to Rosalind Harris. The investigator stepped forward, opened her file, and began to read. A list of 14 individuals currently under criminal or internal investigation. It included 4 police officers previously accused of abusing power, 2 senior investigators who altered case data, 1 retired judge who wiped inadmissible evidence, and most shockingly, 2 assistant district attorneys including ADA Ronald Pierce, once considered the top contender to succeed the Wayne County prosecutor. The crowd erupted. Reporters snapped photos, some live-streamed, and Detroit residents followed every word on their phones and computers. Naomi remained still, her eyes fixed on every face. "This is not retaliation," she said. "This is the truth. And if the truth shakes an entire system, then that system was never stable to begin with." She then revealed a second document, a petition submitted to the federal court and the Michigan Judicial Oversight Committee, calling for a temporary suspension of all cases involving Officer Eric Dunley from the past 7 years, a full review of every conviction signed off by ADA Ronald Pierce, and a special investigation into possible collusion between a group of officers, ADA staff, and political figures in falsifying evidence to pressure black defendants. Each line read like a blow to the ego of a system long proud of its transparency. Naomi knew that after today, she would face sharp retaliation not just from within the profession, but from those behind the curtain, the ones who never step into the light, yet hold the real power. But she also knew, if she didn't act, no one else would. She ended her speech with a piercing reminder. "I'm not afraid of losing reputation. I'm afraid that if I stay silent, one day my granddaughter will have to bow before a system that doesn't value its own principles. I won't let that happen." The courtroom burst into applause, not because she had won, but because she dared. Outside, people formed rings around the courthouse, holding signs. "Justice for Naomi. Detroit won't be silent. Protect our judges." Naomi Carter didn't need a black robe to make the city listen. All she needed was the truth and the courage to speak it. Sometimes, justice doesn't speak in silence. Sometimes, it rises amid a crowd and roars like thunder. And today, in Detroit, justice stepped into the light in the form of a black woman who had once been dismissed, who had once been struck in the very place that was supposed to protect her. The courtroom opened a public session, not to judge a defendant, but to question an entire system that had long remained mute in the face of injustice. Naomi Carter wasn't wearing her judge's robe, but she still sat there surrounded by the press, the public, and those who once believed she would bow her head. Today, they would hear her speak. The courtroom was packed. The walls stood still, almost listening. Reporters crowded the back, cameras ready, and every eye locked on the podium where Naomi was about to rise. "Before I begin," she said, her voice deep and firm, "mind you, this is not about me. This is the story of those who were dismissed, forgotten, labeled because of their skin, their poverty, their lack of voice in this system." The room held its breath. Naomi raised a thick folder marked in red, bearing an official stamp from the Federal Judicial Oversight Office. "This is the list. 14 names. Among them police officers, assistant prosecutors, a retired judge, and a city council member. These individuals did mistakes. They exploited the system, protected each other, built a power network to persecute, distort truth, and erase evidence." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some reporters began typing rapidly. The faces on that list, once considered untouchable, now appeared clearly across breaking news headlines. Naomi didn't stop. "I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I'm here to name names. I don't demand an apology. I demand accountability." A young black female attorney stood up from the back row. She didn't speak, just placed her hand over her heart, eyes brimming. Naomi saw it and understood. It wasn't just support. It was trust, the kind that young women were now placing in her. Then the federal prosecutor stood. A white man, eyes resolute, stepped forward and placed his file on the podium. "We have received evidence from Judge Naomi Carter," he declared. "Based on it, criminal and administrative investigations have been launched. Some individuals on this list are being summoned today. Some have already been suspended." The room erupted. Cameras flashed. A journalist shouted for the names of the accused, but Naomi didn't respond. She simply smiled, not out of victory, but because at last, truth had reached the table. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of citizens had gathered. Banners stretched across the streets. "Justice for all, not just the powerful. Stop the silence. Start the change. We stand with Judge Carter." They weren't just there to watch. They came to act. Naomi stepped out of the courthouse to roaring applause. Police lined either side, not to restrain, but to maintain order for an awakening movement. A CNN reporter approached and asked, "Judge Carter, do you think you've done the impossible?" Naomi looked directly into the camera. "I haven't done the impossible. I've done what should have been done a long time ago." That same afternoon, the Michigan state government held an emergency meeting. A special commission was formed to review all cases connected to individuals on Naomi's list. The governor addressed the state in a live broadcast, promising, "We will not allow any truth to be buried simply because it is inconvenient." That night, Naomi sat alone in her office. Outside, the sounds of car horns and chanting still echoed through the courthouse streets. On her desk, the list now bore new red annotations: under investigation, suspended, removed. But for Naomi, the list wasn't long enough. The system wasn't yet transparent enough. Justice wasn't yet firm enough for her to stop. The door creaked open. Carter, her trusted aide, stepped in. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" she replied. "The sound of justice. It's not whispering anymore. It's shouting." Naomi smiled. A smile both weary and proud. Not going to let it go silent again. The atmosphere in Detroit was no longer the same. On public buildings, banners demanding justice still hung. What began as a seemingly isolated act of violence had become the spark that revealed decades' worth of buried misconduct, and at the epicenter of that earthquake stood no one else but Naomi Carter. Since the public hearing, over 300 case files connected to individuals on her list had been flagged for review. A statewide judicial reform commission was formed in under a week, an unprecedented pace and scale in Michigan's legal history. Following the historic press conference, Naomi voluntarily submitted her resignation as judge of the Detroit Court of Appeals. She stated, "I cannot stand within a system and try to fix it from the outside. I have to step out so I can return as an independent watchdog." And Michigan invited her to do just that, appointing her as Special Oversight Officer for cases involving bias, procedural violations, or judicial misconduct. On television, news segments showed Naomi seated in conference rooms with students, young attorneys, and civil rights advocates, dissecting cases that had long been deemed closed. She was no longer just a symbol. She had become a living catalyst for a generation that believed justice wasn't a privilege, but a basic right. But not all voices were supportive. Some conservative politicians claimed she was fueling anti-system sentiment and creating instability by digging too deep. Naomi didn't respond directly. Instead, she published an op-ed with a single line that said everything. Instability does not come from speaking truth. Instability comes from living in a system that pretends to be just. Those who once stood beside her in the courtroom now returned as collaborators. Naomi was no longer alone, and she didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her voice had become a rallying cry for thousands more. One of the most moving moments came when Naomi was invited to speak at Wayne State Law School's graduation. She stepped onto the stage amid thunderous applause, needing no theatrics or grand words. She simply said, "I used to believe I had to fight just to be in rooms like this. Now I know my job is to widen the doorway, so the next generation walks in without asking permission." Around the same time, the commission released its first report. Over 50% of flagged cases showed signs of ignored evidence, coerced pleas, or unjust plea deals. Those once labeled guardians of justice were now being investigated for abusing the very power they were trusted with. In her modest office at the new commission headquarters, Naomi still drank her black coffee without sugar. She studied a map of Michigan's judicial districts, marking counties with high complaint rates. "We don't tear down the system for revenge," she told her young staff. "We tear it down to stitch it back together properly." One late evening, after hours of reviewing documents, Naomi received a handwritten letter. It was from a middle-aged woman who had been wrongfully imprisoned 17 years ago based on false testimony. In the letter, she wrote, "I don't know if justice can undo the past, but today I see hope. Not in a courtroom, but in a person you." Naomi held the letter for a long time. She knew justice didn't always come with loud victories. It came in whispered admissions, in long-buried truths, and in the rekindled eyes of people who had lost all faith. Detroit was no longer the same, and neither was Naomi Carter. But one thing had never changed. She still believed in the law, not the kind written in honor, but the kind etched in real fairness. There are thunderclaps that don't echo through the skies, but rise from deep within people's hearts. And in a small room inside an old red brick building at the heart of Detroit, that thunder resounded quiet yet undeniable. Justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied. Naomi Carter sat by the window, the late afternoon sun stretching across her desk, which was still covered with case files, documents that were no longer a burden, but milestones of a journey. After more than 40 years in the justice system, Naomi once believed silence was necessary to preserve stability. But now she knew, silence had been the very tool that allowed injustice to thrive. A news segment played on the television in the corner. Judge Naomi Carter officially stepped down today, after releasing internal documents that led to over 140 retrials across Michigan. Public discussion was still raging, but within her, there was a rare sense of peace. Not because it was over, but because, in the end, she had not backed down. At her final press conference, she stood before the crowd and said what would later be quoted again and again. "The slap across my face wasn't just an act of violence. It was the wake-up call for a system that had grown complacent in its privilege, and I was simply the one who turned on the light." That evening, Naomi returned to her old home on Detroit's east side. where she lived with her sister and her young granddaughter, Layla. The little girl waited for her on the porch, a storybook in hand, eyes lighting up as Naomi appeared. "My teacher talked about you today," Layla said. "They called you the woman who changed the law." Naomi chuckled, a sound laced with both warmth and bitterness. "No, sweetheart. I just changed the way people listen to the law." Layla leaned into her, resting her head on Naomi's shoulder. "Grandma, I want to be a judge someday too." Naomi paused, then replied, "Don't just become a judge, Layla. Be the one who changes the system not out of anger, but because you know the truth." There they sat, 2 generations, one who had walked the long road, and one yet to begin. Between them was something unshakable, belief that justice can be rebuilt, and that truth deserves a voice. The next morning, Naomi left the house early, her steps steady but unhurried. No security detail, no microphones pointing her way. But she walked as if all eyes were still on her, not for recognition, but for responsibility. She arrived at her new office where she now served as Michigan's independent judicial advisor. There was no judge's bench, no high wooden podium, but never had she felt closer to justice. Here, she didn't pass rulings. She rebuilt. She listened to victims, reviewed files, and repaired the broken links of a system she once trusted implicitly. Carter, her longtime aide, entered with a stack of paperwork reform proposals for the prosecutorial office. "We're starting with 2 people," he said. 7 of them were involved in cases tied to the investigation list. "Do you still want to keep them?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. She flipped through the pages, studying each name. "Not all of them are beyond redemption," she said slowly. "But justice demands more than doubt. It demands transparency. Review each one publicly." Carter nodded. "I'll take care of it." Naomi walked to the window. Below, a group of elementary school kids were visiting the old courthouse, her former workplace. One curly-haired girl pointed to the newly hung portrait near the main entrance. It was Naomi, not in a robe, but in plain clothes, holding a folder, staring straight into the camera. "Who's that lady?" the little girl asked. The tour guide replied, "That's the woman who turned a slap into the largest judicial reform movement in this state's history." Naomi heard the words. She didn't smile. She simply placed a hand over her heart and let herself sit in silent gratitude. Because in the end, she hadn't just reclaimed justice for herself, she had left behind a system that now feared the truth. "I've lived long enough to understand one thing. Justice doesn't arrive on its own. It takes people who dare to stand when everything around them says, 'Stay silent.'" That slap didn't bring me down. It only reminded me that silence is also a form of complicity. And if I don't break that cycle, then who will? I don't need to be called a hero. I just need the next generation children like my granddaughter not to walk into courtrooms afraid of being dismissed because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their willingness to speak the truth. Because justice isn't found in a chair. It's found in the things we choose to do when no one else believes doing the right thing still matters. If this story touched something in you, help share it. Leave a comment, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We'll continue bringing you more real stories, filled with courage, that you won't be able to look away from. Because sometimes, a single video doesn't just make you think. It changes the way you see the world.